The dust had barely settled on Frank Patterson's boots when he first saw Olivia Ramsey fall from her horse at 8 years old, her father cursing as he ran to scoop her up. And Frank had known even then that some part of his life would forever be tied to the dark-haired girl who got right back in the saddle with tears streaming down her face. It was 1869 in Oatman, Arizona, and the ranch where Frank worked stretched across the harsh desert landscape like a promise of something permanent in a world that felt anything but. Thomas Ramsey was the best foreman the Double Creek Ranch had ever seen, and everyone knew it. He ran the outfit with an iron will tempered by fairness, and the men respected him for it. Frank had hired on at 17, barely more than a boy himself, running from a past in Texas that included a dead father and a mother who had remarried a man with fists like hammers. Thomas had taken one look at the tall, lean kid with serious gray eyes and given him a chance. That chance had turned into 12 years of hard work, loyalty, and a friendship that ran deeper than most blood ties. Olivia had been a fixture around the ranch from the moment Frank arrived. She followed her father everywhere, a tiny shadow with braids the color of burnt sienna and eyes that seemed to take in everything. Her mother had died giving birth to her, leaving Thomas to raise his daughter alone while managing 2,000 head of cattle and 20 ranch hands. The girl grew up wild and free, learning to ride before she could properly raid, sitting in on her father's meetings, and absorbing the rhythms of ranch life like some children learned their letters. Frank had watched her grow with the detached fondness of an older brother, teaching her to rope when Thomas was too busy, pulling her from scrapes when her adventurous nature led her into trouble. When she was 10, he had found her cornered by a rattlesnake near the horse barn and had dispatched it with a quick shovel strike, earning her eternal gratitude and a wildflower crown she had woven for him the next day. When she was 13, he had caught her trying to smoke one of the ranch hand cigarettes behind the stable and had made her promise never to do it again, keeping the secret from her father out of respect for her pride. The years passed with the relentless heat of the Arizona sun, each season marked by roundups and brandings, by dust storms that blotted out the sky, by the occasional excitement of a cattle drive to the railhead in Kingman. Frank rose through the ranks to become Thomas's right hand, the man the foreman trusted above all others to execute his vision for the ranch. Owner Harrison Wells was an absentee landlord who lived in San Francisco and cared only that the profits kept rolling in, which meant Thomas ran the operation as if it were his own. It was in the spring of 1878 that everything changed for Frank, though he did not immediately recognize it for what it was. Olivia had been away at a finishing school in Tucson for nearly 2 years, sent there by her father despite her vociferous protests. Thomas had insisted she needed some polish, some education beyond what the ranch could provide, even as she argued that she could learn everything she needed right there in the desert. But Thomas Ramsey was nothing if not stubborn, and off she went, leaving a strange emptiness in the daily rhythms of ranch life that Frank noticed but did not examine too closely. He was mending a fence line on the eastern pasture when he heard the commotion from the main house. Riders were coming in, and even from a distance, he could hear the excitement in the voices carrying across the flat land. Frank tied off his work and headed back, curious about what could cause such a stir on a regular Wednesday afternoon. The sight that greeted him in the ranch yard stopped him dead in his tracks. Olivia had returned, but this was not the 16-year-old girl who had left with rebellion in her eyes and dust on her riding skirt. The young woman who stood beside her father's horse was something else entirely. She had grown taller, her frame filling out into curves that her simple traveling dress could not quite hide. Her hair, no longer in braids, cascaded down her back in thick waves that caught the sunlight like polished mahogany. But it was her face that truly arrested Frank's attention. The soft roundness of childhood had been replaced by high cheekbones, and a jawline that spoke of her father's strength, while her eyes, those dark eyes he remembered, now held a depth and intelligence that made his chest tighten in a way he did not understand. She was laughing at something Thomas had said, her head thrown back with unself-conscious joy, and Frank felt the world tilt on its axis. This was not the girl he had pulled from scrapes and taught to rope cattle. This was a woman, fully formed and beautiful, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. "Frank," Thomas called out, spotting him across the yard, "come meet my daughter. She's finally home where she belongs." Frank forced his legs to move, forced a smile to his face that felt stiff and unnatural. As he approached, Olivia turned those eyes on him, and for a moment he saw surprise flicker across her features. "Frank Patterson," she said, and her voice had changed too, deeper and richer than he remembered. "You have not changed a bit." "Cannot say the same for you, Miss Olivia," he heard himself say, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Tucson seems to have agreed with you." "Tucson was a prison," she replied with a flash of the spirit he remembered. "But I am home now, and I do not intend to leave again." Thomas laughed and clapped Frank on the shoulder. "She gave those teachers all kinds of trouble, from what I hear. Nearly got herself expelled twice for sneaking out to visit the livery stables. Apparently, deportment lessons could not compete with her love of horses." "Some things do not change, Papa," Olivia said, but her eyes were still on Frank, studying him with an intensity that made him want to fidget like a schoolboy. "Though other things do, I suppose." Frank excused himself as soon as politeness allowed, retreating to the bunkhouse with his thoughts in chaos. He was 29 years old, nearly a full 12 years older than Olivia. He had known her since she was a child. She was Thomas Ramsey's daughter, and Thomas was not just his boss, but the closest thing to family Frank had in this world. The thoughts that were crowding his mind now were not just inappropriate. They were a betrayal of the trust that had been placed in him. He threw himself into work with renewed intensity over the following weeks, taking the most distant assignments, volunteering for the overnight watches, anything to keep himself away from the main house and the increasing likelihood of running into Olivia. But the ranch was only so big, and she was everywhere. She had taken up her old habits immediately, riding out with her father each morning, sitting in on the ranch meetings, making her presence felt in every corner of the operation. Frank noticed that she had indeed learned things in Tucson. She kept the ranch books now, her neat handwriting filling ledgers with figures that Thomas admitted were far more organized than his own rough scratchings had ever been. She had opinions about the breeding program, and was not shy about voicing them, often engaging Frank or the other senior hands in spirited debates about bloodlines and conformation. She had grown into her role as the foreman's daughter, commanding respect from the men not through her father's authority, but through her own demonstrated knowledge and capability. And she seemed determined to single Frank out for attention. "You are avoiding me," she announced one evening, cornering him in the stable where he was checking on a mare with a swollen hock. "Have I done something to offend you, Frank?" He kept his eyes on the horse's leg, running practiced hands over the heat and swelling. "No offense taken, Miss Olivia. Just been busy with work." "Do not call me Miss Olivia," she said, and there was a note of frustration in her voice that made him look up despite himself. "You never used to do that. I am just Olivia, same as I always was." "Things change," he said carefully, reaching for the liniment. "You are not a kid anymore. It is proper to show respect." She moved closer, and he was suddenly acutely aware of her presence in the confined space of the stall. She smelled of lavender and sunshine, and he had to force himself to focus on the task at hand. "I do not want your respect," she said quietly. "I want my friend back, the man who taught me to rope and kept my secrets and made me feel like I could do anything." Frank straightened, putting the horse between them like a barrier. "That was a long time ago, Olivia. You were a child then." "And now I am not," she said, her eyes challenging him. "Is that what troubles you, Frank? That I grew up?" He did not have an answer for that, at least not one he could voice. Instead, he made an excuse about needing to check the other horses and left her standing in the stall, his heart pounding in his chest like he had just finished a hard gallop. Summer settled over Oatman with its characteristic fury, temperatures climbing past 100 degrees by midday, turning the desert into a shimmering oven. The cattle grew sluggish and bad-tempered, clustering around the few water sources, and the men worked in shifts to keep them spread out and prevent overgrazing. It was during one of these shifts that disaster nearly struck. Frank was riding the northern pasture with two younger hands when they spotted the dust cloud. It was too big to be a few stray cattle, too fast-moving to be anything but trouble. As it got closer, Frank realized with growing horror that it was a stampede, hundreds of head running blind in the heat, spooked by something and now beyond the control of any rational thought. "Ride," he shouted to the other men. "Get to high ground and stay there." But even as he yelled the warning, he saw another rider in the path of the stampede. The horse was distinctive, a gray mare with white stockings that he recognized instantly. It was Snowfall, Olivia's personal mount, and that meant Olivia herself was directly in the path of 2,000 pounds of panicked beef. Frank did not think. He could not afford to. He drove his heels into his gelding sides and sent the animal flying across the hard, packed earth, angling to intercept Olivia before the cattle reached her. He could see her now, could see that she had realized the danger and was trying to turn her mare toward safety, but the horse was fighting her, ears pinned back in fear. Time seemed to slow and speed up simultaneously. Frank reached her position with seconds to spare, leaning out of his saddle to grab Snowfall's bridle and haul both horse and rider toward a rocky outcropping that jutted up from the desert floor. The cattle thundered past, their bellowing and the sound of their hooves like the end of the world, dust so thick it choked the air and blotted out the sun. They huddled against the rocks, Frank's body instinctively curving around Olivia's, protecting her from the flying debris and the possibility of a stray hoof. The stampede seemed to last forever, but in reality, it was probably less than 5 minutes before the tail end of the herd passed by and the dust began to settle. Frank became aware that he was holding Olivia against his chest, her face pressed into his shirt, his arms wrapped around her in a grip that was probably too tight. He could feel her trembling, could feel his own heart racing against his ribs. Slowly, carefully, he loosened his hold and pulled back to look at her face. "Are you hurt?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, hoarse with fear and dust. She shook her head, but her eyes were wide and her face was pale beneath the coating of dirt. "I am fine. You saved my life, Frank." "What were you doing out here alone?" The fear was transmuting into anger now, the way it often did when someone he cared about had nearly been hurt. "You know better than to ride the far pastures without a partner." "I was looking for you," she said, and the simple honesty of it stopped his building tirade dead. "You have been avoiding me for weeks, and I needed to talk to you." "This is not the time," Frank said, even as something in his chest twisted at her words. "We need to get back, make sure no one else was caught in that mess." But Olivia caught his arm as he started to turn away. "When will it be the time, Frank? When will you stop running from me?" "I am not running," he said, but they both knew it was a lie. You are terrified, she said, and her voice was gentle now, understanding in a way that made it worse. You are terrified because you feel something for me and you think it is wrong, because of my father, because of our history, because you watch me grow up. Frank stared at her, this young woman who seemed to see right through all his carefully constructed defenses. Olivia, do not do this. Why not? She stepped closer, and he found he could not make himself back away. I am 18 years old, Frank. I am not a child, no matter how much you want to pretend I am, and I have been in love with you since I was 15 years old. The words hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and his ability to think clearly. You do not know what you are saying. You were at school. You probably met dozens of boys your own age. I met exactly 3 boys my own age, and all of them bored me to tears with their talk of their father's businesses and their plans to attend university, Olivia said. None of them had ever mended a fence, or delivered a calf, or sat under the stars discussing the nature of the universe. None of them looked at me like I was a partner instead of a possession. None of them were you. Your father would never approve, Frank said, grasping at the one argument he thought might have weight. My father respects you more than any man alive, Olivia countered. He trusts you. He values your judgment. Why would he object to me choosing a man with those qualities? Because I am 12 years older than you. Because I have nothing to offer you but a cowboy's wages and a hard life. Because you deserve better than a broken-down ranch hand with no prospects. Olivia's eyes flashed with anger now, the first real temper he had seen from her since her return. Do not presume to tell me what I deserve, Frank Patterson. And do not insult me by pretending this is about my welfare when it is really about your fear. You are afraid to want something for yourself. You are afraid to believe you could be worthy of being loved. The truth of her words cut deeper than any knife. Frank turned away, staring out at the settling dust, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Even if everything you said was true, I would not come to you until you had a real choice. Until you had seen enough of the world to know that this life, this place, this is what you truly want, not just the romantic notion of a girl who grew up on a ranch. When he looked back at her, Olivia's expression had softened. She reached out and touched his cheek, and he let himself feel the warmth of her palm against his skin. Then I will wait, she said quietly. I will prove to you that I know my own mind. But do not ask me to pretend I do not feel what I feel, Frank. I cannot do that. I will not. They rode back to the ranch in silence, and Frank spent the rest of the day dealing with the aftermath of the stampede. 3 steers had broken legs and had to be put down, and one of the younger hands had been thrown from his horse and suffered a broken collarbone, but otherwise, the damage was minimal. Thomas listened to Frank's report with his characteristic attention to detail, then nodded his satisfaction. Good work keeping everyone safe, the foreman said. Heard you pulled Olivia out of the path. I owe you a debt for that. Frank shook his head. No debt between us, Thomas. You know that. Thomas studied him for a long moment, and Frank had the uncomfortable feeling that the older man could see more than Frank wanted him to. But all Thomas said was, she is headstrong like her mother was. Cannot tell her anything once she has made up her mind about something. Just has to hope she has sense enough to choose the right path. Frank thought about those words long into the night, lying in his bunk and listening to the snores of the other hands. He thought about the feel of Olivia in his arms, about the certainty in her voice when she said she loved him, about the future that seemed to shimmer before him like a mirage in the desert heat, beautiful and probably impossible to reach. The weeks that followed established a strange new pattern. Olivia did not push him again, did not corner him for private conversations or make declarations of her feelings. Instead, she simply existed in his orbit, working alongside him and the other hands, proving her capability and her commitment to ranch life day after day. She helped with the branding, getting smoke stained and sweaty and never complaining. She rode fence lines and checked water sources. She worked in the ranch office, managing correspondence with buyers and keeping the books in impeccable order. And slowly, despite his best efforts to maintain distance, Frank found himself drawn to her again. Not as the little girl he had once protected, but as a partner, someone whose opinion he valued and whose presence he sought out without conscious thought. They fell into conversations about the ranch, about the cattle, about the thousand small decisions that went into running an operation this size. He found that she had a mind for strategy, that she could see connections and possibilities that sometimes eluded even Thomas. "We should try breeding the Shorthorns with the Longhorns," she said one evening as they reviewed the breeding records. "The Shorthorns have better meat, but they are not as hardy in this climate. The Longhorns can survive anything but do not bring as good a price. A cross might give us the best of both." Frank considered the idea, turning it over in his mind. "It is risky, could end up with animals that have the worst traits of both instead of the best." "Everything worth doing is a risk," Olivia said, looking up from the ledger to meet his eyes. "That is what makes it worthwhile." He knew she was not just talking about cattle breeding, but he let the comment pass. "I will talk to your father about it. It has merit." Thomas not only approved the breeding experiment, but put Frank and Olivia in charge of managing it, which meant they spent even more time together. Frank told himself it was just work, just the necessities of the job, but he could not quite make himself believe it. He noticed things about her that he had no business noticing: the way she chewed her bottom lip when she was thinking hard, the sound of her laugh when something genuinely amused her, the competent grace of her hands as she worked with the horses or wrote in the ledgers. Fall came to the desert, bringing cooler temperatures and the preparation for the autumn cattle drive. This was always the biggest event of the year, moving 1,000 head of cattle north to the railhead, a journey that took 2 weeks and required every able-bodied hand on the ranch. Thomas would lead the drive as he always did, and Frank would ride as his second in command. The night before they were set to leave, Olivia found Frank checking his gear in the barn. The lantern light cast her face in warm shadows, and Frank's chest tightened at the sight of her. "I want to go on the drive," she said without preamble. Frank shook his head before she had even finished speaking. "Your father will never agree to that. It is too dangerous." "My father does not get to make every decision about my life," Olivia said, but there was more sadness than anger in her voice. "I have done everything right, Frank. I stayed at that awful school even though I hated every minute of it. I came back and proved I could work as hard as any hand on this ranch. I have been patient and proper and everything a dutiful daughter should be. But I am suffocating. I need to do something that is mine, something that proves I am more than just Thomas Ramsey's daughter." Frank heard the desperation beneath her words and felt his resolve wavering. "What do you want me to do, Olivia?" "Talk to him," she said. "He listens to you, respects your opinion. If you say I should go, he might actually consider it. And if something happens to you on the drive, if you get hurt or worse, your father would never forgive me and I would never forgive myself." Olivia stepped closer, and he could see the unshed tears glittering in her eyes. "I am already hurt, Frank. Every day that I have to pretend to be less than what I am, every time I have to watch you walk away from me, every moment I spend waiting for a life that might never come, that hurts worse than any physical injury ever could." He reached out before he could stop himself, brushing away a tear that had escaped to trail down her cheek. The moment his skin touched hers, something shifted between them, the air growing heavy with all the words they were not saying, all the feelings they were trying to deny. "You undo me," Frank whispered, and it was as close to a confession as he had ever come. "You make me want things I have no right to want." "Then want them," Olivia said fiercely. "Want me. Let yourself have something good, Frank. Let yourself be happy." He let his hand fall away, stepping back before he could do something stupid like pull her into his arms and kiss her the way he had been dreaming about for months. "I will talk to your father about the drive," he said instead, "but I am making no promises." To Frank's surprise, Thomas agreed to let Olivia join the cattle drive after only token resistance. "She has been pestering me about it for weeks," the foreman admitted. "And truth is, she has proven herself capable. If you are willing to keep an extra eye on her, make sure she does not take any foolish risks, I suppose I can allow it." Frank agreed, though he suspected he was agreeing to his own torture. 2 weeks on the trail with Olivia, watching her every day, working alongside her, sleeping under the same stars. It would be a test of his willpower that he was not sure he could pass. The drive began at dawn on a crisp October morning, 1,000 head of cattle moving north in a river of brown and white, their lowing and the shouts of the drovers filling the air. Olivia rode near the front with Frank and Thomas, her seat in the saddle as confident as any veteran cowboy. She had tied her hair back in a practical braid and wore range clothes that had seen better days, looking nothing like the polished young woman who had returned from Tucson, and everything like the girl Frank had first met all those years ago. The first few days passed without incident, long hours in the saddle punctuated by brief stops for meals and rest. The nights were cool and clear, and the crews spread out around the herd in shifts, making sure no predators or rustlers got too close. Frank found himself seeking out Olivia's company during the evening meals, sitting beside her at the fire and talking about nothing and everything. "I forgot how beautiful it is out here," she said one night, staring up at the stars that hung overhead like scattered diamonds. In Tucson, there were too many buildings, too many lights. You could not see the sky properly. "Desert sky is special," Frank agreed, following her gaze. "Makes you feel small, but in a good way. Reminds you that there is more to the world than your own troubles." "Do you ever think about leaving?" Olivia asked. Seeing what else is out there, Frank considered the question. "I did when I was younger. Thought maybe I would go to California, try my luck in the gold fields or find work on one of those big ranches up north. But then I realized I already had everything I needed right here. Good work, people I respect, land that challenges me. What more could a man want? Love," Olivia said softly, turning to look at him. "A family, someone to share it all with." Frank met her eyes, saw the question and the hope there, and felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. "That too." On the 7th night of the drive, trouble found them. Frank was riding night watch with 2 other hands when he heard the sound that made every cattleman's blood run cold, the nervous lowing of disturbed cattle, the sound of hoofbeats where there should be none. He turned his horse toward the sound, his hand automatically moving to the rifle in his saddle scabbard. The rustlers came out of the darkness with bandanas over their faces, 4 men on fast horses trying to cut a portion of the herd away from the main group. Frank fired a warning shot into the air and shouted for help, and suddenly the night exploded into chaos. The other hands came running, and the rustlers found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered. But in the confusion, one of the rustlers broke away, driving his horse straight toward the camp where the off-duty hands were sleeping. Frank saw with horror that Olivia had emerged from her bedroll, drawn by the commotion, and was directly in the man's path. He did not remember making the decision to pursue. His body simply reacted, driving his gelding forward in a flat-out gallop. He intercepted the rustler yards from the camp, launching himself from his saddle in a flying tackle that took both men to the ground. They rolled in the dust, trading blows, and Frank felt a fist connect with his jaw hard enough to make his vision blur. Then there was a sharp crack, and the rustler went limp beneath him. Frank looked up to see Olivia standing over them with a heavy branch in her hands, her face set in lines of grim determination. "Are you all right?" she asked, dropping the branch and reaching down to help him up. Frank took her hand and let her pull him to his feet, aware that his face was probably going to sport some impressive bruises come morning. "I am fine. You should not have gotten involved." "You are welcome," Olivia said dryly, but her hands were shaking as she brushed the dust from her clothes. "Perhaps next time I will let him ride right through." Thomas arrived with the other hands, dragging the remaining rustlers with them. The would-be thieves were tied up and left trussed like Thanksgiving turkeys, destined for the nearest sheriff once the drive reached its destination. Thomas checked on both Frank and Olivia with a sharp eye, then nodded his satisfaction that neither was seriously hurt. "Good work," he said to Frank, then turned to his daughter. "And you, that was either very brave or very foolish. I have not decided which yet. Cannot it be both?" Olivia asked, and despite everything, Frank found himself smiling. The rest of the drive passed without further excitement, and they reached the railhead at Kingman on schedule. The cattle were loaded onto train cars destined for markets back east, and Thomas negotiated a price with the buyer that had him nodding with satisfaction. It had been a successful drive, and that meant bonuses for all the hands and a healthy profit for the ranch. They stayed in Kingman for 2 days, letting the men have a chance to spend their wages in the town's saloons and stores, to sleep in real beds and eat food they had not cooked over a campfire. Frank found himself with a rare afternoon of leisure and was wandering the main street when Olivia appeared at his side. "Buy me dinner," she said, and it was not quite a question. Frank looked at her, at the determination in her eyes and the set of her jaw, and found he did not want to refuse. "Your father is currently drinking whiskey with the buyer and discussing bloodlines," Olivia interrupted. "He will not miss me for a few hours. Please, Frank, just dinner. 2 friends sharing a meal, nothing scandalous about that." They found a small restaurant that served decent steaks and potatoes, and Frank found himself relaxing in a way he had not allowed himself to in months. Olivia talked about the drive, about the things she had learned, and the things she wanted to change when they got back to the ranch. She was animated and enthusiastic, and Frank realized all over again how much he enjoyed simply being in her presence. "Thank you for convincing Papa to let me come," she said as they finished their meal. "This has been one of the best experiences of my life. I feel like I finally proved something, not just to everyone else but to myself." "You have always been capable," Frank said. "Some people just needed time to see it." "And what about you?" Olivia asked, leaning forward. "Do you see me now, Frank? Really see me?" He looked at her across the table, this woman who had somehow become the center of his world without him quite realizing when it had happened. He saw her strength and her intelligence, her fierce determination and her generous heart. He saw the girl she had been and the woman she had become, and he saw finally that he had been a fool to think he could resist her. "I see you," he said quietly. "God help me, Olivia, I see you." Her smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Then stop fighting this. Stop fighting us." Frank reached across the table and took her hand, feeling the calluses from ranch work on her palm, the strength in her fingers as they curled around his. "I cannot court you properly while we are on the trail, and I will not do anything to compromise your reputation or disrespect your father. But when we get back to the ranch, if you are still sure this is what you want, I will talk to Thomas. I will ask his permission to court you properly." "I have never been more sure of anything in my life," Olivia said, and the joy in her voice made Frank's chest feel too tight to breathe properly. They rode back to Oatman with the rest of the crew, but everything felt different now. There was an understanding between Frank and Olivia, an acknowledgement of what they both wanted and where they were heading. Frank caught Thomas watching them more than once during the journey home, his expression thoughtful, but the foreman said nothing. It was not until they had been back at the ranch for 3 days that Frank finally worked up the courage to seek out Thomas for a private conversation. He found the foreman in the office, going over the profit ledgers from the cattle sale, and Thomas looked up with a knowing expression when Frank knocked on the door frame. "Figured you would be coming to see me," Thomas said, setting down his pencil. "Might as well sit down and say your piece." Frank sat, his hat in his hands, feeling more nervous than he had facing down the rustlers on the drive. "I want to ask your permission to court Olivia, sir, properly and with honorable intentions." Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying Frank with those sharp eyes that never missed anything. "How long have you felt this way about my daughter?" Frank considered lying, then dismissed the idea. Thomas deserved the truth. "Since she came back from Tucson, I have been trying to fight it. She deserves better than a cowboy with nothing to his name but a horse and a bedroll." "Seems to me my daughter should be the one to decide what she deserves," Thomas said. "And she has made her feelings pretty clear to anyone with eyes to see. Question is, are you serious about this? Because Olivia is not some girl you court for a season and then move on from. If you start this, I expect you to see it through." "I love her," Frank said, and saying the words out loud for the first time felt like stepping off a cliff into empty air. "I did not want to. I tried not to, but I do, and I want to build a life with her if she will have me." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and Frank felt every second stretch like an eternity. Finally, the foreman nodded. "You are a good man, Frank Patterson. Best man I have ever worked with and one of the best I have ever known. If Olivia is set on you, then I suppose I could not ask for a better son-in-law. You have my permission to court her. But you treat her right, you hear me? You give her the respect and the love she deserves, or you will answer to me." "Yes, sir," Frank said, relief flooding through him so powerfully he felt lightheaded. "Thank you, Thomas. You will not regret this." "I better not," Thomas said, but there was warmth in his voice. "Now get out of here and go tell my daughter the good news before she wears a hole in the floorboards pacing." Frank found Olivia in the stable, grooming Snowfall with more vigor than necessary, her tension evident in every line of her body. She looked up when he entered, and he saw fear and hope warring in her eyes. "Well?" she asked, and her voice was barely above a whisper. Frank crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms, feeling her melt against him with a sigh that seemed to come from her very soul. "He said yes," Frank murmured against her hair. "I can court you properly now, if you still want that." Olivia pulled back just enough to look up at him, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling. "I have wanted that for 3 years, Frank Patterson. I am not about to change my mind now." He kissed her then, finally letting himself do what he had been dreaming about for months. Her lips were soft and warm, and she kissed him back with an enthusiasm that made his head spin. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Frank rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said, and the words came easy now that he had permission to say them. "I think I have loved you for longer than I wanted to admit." "I love you too," Olivia said. "I have loved you since I was 15 years old and you found me crying in the hayloft because I did not want to leave for Tucson. You sat with me for hours, telling me stories about the ranch and promising that everything would be here waiting when I got back. That is when I knew. They courted properly after that, though propriety was sometimes a struggle given that they lived in the same place and worked together every day. Frank took Olivia into town on Sunday afternoons, buying her ice cream at the Mercantile and walking with her along the dusty streets. They sat on the porch in the evenings, talking about their days and their dreams for the future, always with Thomas or one of the other hands within sight to maintain propriety. But it was in the work that they truly connected. They managed the breeding program together, tracking results and making decisions about which animals to keep and which to sell. They rode out together to check fence lines and water sources, falling into conversations that ranged from the practical to the philosophical. Frank taught Olivia things about ranching that even Thomas had not gotten around to, and she brought insights from her education that opened up new ways of thinking about old problems. The ranch hands quickly adjusted to seeing Frank and Olivia together, and if there was any gossip about the cowboy courting the foreman's daughter, it was good-natured and approving. Frank had worked alongside most of these men for years, earning their respect through hard work and fair treatment, and they seemed genuinely happy to see him finding happiness. Winter came to the Arizona desert, bringing cold nights and occasional rain that turned the landscape briefly green. Frank used some of his savings to buy Olivia a proper courting gift, a silver necklace with a small turquoise stone that he presented to her on Christmas Eve. She cried when she opened the small box, throwing her arms around his neck and thanking him in a voice choked with emotion. "It is not much," Frank said, feeling inadequate as he always did when it came to material things. "But the turquoise reminded me of the Arizona sky, and that reminded me of you." "It is perfect," Olivia said fiercely. "You are perfect, Frank." He laughed at that. "I am many things, but perfect is not one of them." "You are perfect for me," she insisted. "That is all that matters." As spring approached, Frank began thinking seriously about the future. He wanted to marry Olivia, wanted it with an intensity that sometimes surprised him, but he was acutely aware that he had nothing concrete to offer her. He was 30 years old with no property to his name, no prospects beyond his wages as a ranch hand. It did not seem like enough for someone like Olivia, who deserved the world. It was Thomas who provided the solution, calling Frank into his office on a warm March morning. "I have been thinking," the foreman said without preamble. "Harrison Wells has been talking about expanding the operation, maybe acquiring some of the land to the south. He is going to need someone to manage that expansion, someone he can trust to run it like their own." Frank nodded slowly, not sure where this was going. "Makes sense. The southern range has good water and plenty of grass." "I recommended you for the job," Thomas said, and Frank felt his jaw drop in surprise. Wells agreed. "He is willing to make you foreman of the new operation with a share of the profits and a homestead on the land. It would be yours, Frank." "A real chance to build something." "Thomas, I cannot take that," Frank protested. "You are the foreman. This should be yours." "I am getting old," Thomas said, though at 52 he was hardly ancient, "and I have been doing this job for 20 years. Time for someone younger and hungrier to take on the challenges of expansion. Besides, if you are going to marry my daughter, you need to be able to provide for her properly. This way, you will have a home to bring her to, land to build on, a future that is your own." Frank felt emotion clog his throat, making it hard to speak. "You did not have to do this. I would have found a way." "I know you would have," Thomas said, "but Olivia is my daughter and I want her happy and secure, and you are the closest thing to a son I have ever had, Frank. Consider this my way of taking care of both of you." The southern expansion moved forward rapidly over the next few months. Frank worked with Wells's lawyers to draw up the agreements, securing not just a management position but actual ownership of 160 acres on the edge of the new range. He threw himself into building a house on that land, working every spare moment to construct a home that would be worthy of Olivia. It was not a grand house by any measure, just 4 rooms and a porch, but Frank built it with his own hands and with care, making sure every board was straight and every nail was driven true. The other hands helped when they could, and slowly the structure took shape on a rise that overlooked a seasonal creek and provided views of the desert stretching away to the mountains. Olivia rode out to see the house's progress nearly every day, offering suggestions and helping where she could. She had opinions about everything from the placement of the windows to the design of the kitchen, and Frank found himself incorporating all of her ideas, wanting the house to feel like hers as much as his. "We should put a garden here," she said one afternoon, pacing off an area near the house. "It will need a fence to keep the rabbits out, but we could grow vegetables and maybe some flowers. You want to be a farmer's wife now," Frank teased, and she threw a handful of dirt at him. "I want to be your wife," she said simply. "Everything else is just details." Frank had been planning to wait until the house was finished before proposing, but her words broke through his resolve. He dropped to one knee right there in the dirt and pulled out the ring he had been carrying for weeks, a simple gold band that had cost him 3 months of wages. "Olivia Ramsey," he said, and his voice was shaking. "Will you marry me? Will you take a chance on a cowboy who loves you more than he ever thought possible and who promises to spend every day of his life trying to be worthy of you?" Olivia's hands flew to her mouth, tears already streaming down her face. "Yes," she said, the word coming out half laugh and half sob. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her down into his arms, kissing her with all the love and promise he could pour into the gesture. When they finally broke apart, both of them were crying and laughing and covered in dust, and Frank thought he had never been happier in his entire life. They were married in the spring of 1880, with the whole ranch turning out for the celebration. The ceremony took place under the big oak tree near the main house, with a visiting circuit preacher officiating and Olivia looking so beautiful in her white dress that Frank forgot to breathe when he saw her walking toward him. Thomas gave her away with tears in his eyes, shaking Frank's hand and pulling him into a rough embrace before stepping back to let the ceremony proceed. Frank made his vows with a clear voice and a full heart, promising to love and honor and cherish Olivia for the rest of his days. When the preacher finally pronounced them husband and wife, Frank kissed his bride to the cheers and applause of everyone gathered, and he knew that this moment would be etched in his memory forever. The reception lasted well into the night, with food and music and dancing under the stars. Frank danced with his wife, marveling at the fact that he could call her that now, that Olivia Patterson was his, and he was hers in the eyes of God and the law. Thomas clapped him on the shoulder at one point and whispered, "Take care of her, son," and Frank nodded, too emotional to speak. They moved into the house on the southern range, and Frank threw himself into making the new operation a success. The work was hard and the hours were long, but he had Olivia beside him, working as his partner in everything. She managed the books and handled correspondence with buyers, rode out with him to check the herds, and proved herself invaluable in 1,000 different ways. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. There were droughts and predators, difficult births and broken fences, all the trials that came with ranching in the harsh Arizona climate. But they faced everything together, and Frank found that challenges were easier to bear when he had Olivia's hand to hold and her strength to lean on. At night, they would sit on their porch and watch the sun set over the desert, talking about their day and making plans for the future. Frank would hold Olivia close and marvel at how his life had turned out, at the fact that he got to wake up beside her every morning and fall asleep with her in his arms every night. "Are you happy?" he asked her one evening, suddenly needing to hear the answer. Olivia turned in his arms to look at him, her eyes soft and full of love. "I have never been happier, Frank. This life, this place, it is everything I ever wanted. I spent years watching you, waiting for you to see me as more than a child, hoping that one day you would let yourself love me. And now that I have you, now that we have built this life together, I cannot imagine wanting anything more." "I was a fool to wait so long," Frank said, kissing her forehead. "I should have seen what was right in front of me years ago." "You saw me when I needed you to," Olivia said. "You waited until I was old enough to truly know my own mind, old enough to make a real choice. That is one of the things I love most about you, Frank. You have always respected me, always treated me as an equal even when the world would have given you permission to do otherwise." Their first child was born in the spring of 1881, a healthy boy they named Thomas Franklin Patterson in honor of Olivia's father and Frank's new life. Thomas Ramsey was ecstatic to be a grandfather, spending every spare moment at their house and doting on his grandson with shameless affection. Frank watched Olivia with their son and fell in love with her all over again, seeing new depths of strength and tenderness in her as she navigated motherhood. The Southern Range expansion was proving successful, with their herds growing and their reputation spreading. Buyers began seeking out Patterson Ranch specifically, knowing they would get quality cattle and honest dealing. Frank hired on 3 new hands to help manage the increasing workload, men he trusted and who proved themselves worthy of that trust. Little Thomas was barely walking when Olivia told Frank she was pregnant again, and this time they welcomed twin girls into the world. Mary and Margaret Patterson were born on a cold January morning, and Frank found himself completely overwhelmed by the reality of being a father to 3 children under 3 years old. But Olivia took it all in stride, managing the household and the ranch books and 3 babies with a grace that left Frank in awe. Thomas Ramsey retired from his position as foreman of the Double Creek Ranch when he was 56, turning over his duties to a younger man and building himself a small house on the edge of Frank and Olivia's property. He spent his days helping with his grandchildren and offering advice when asked, content in his retirement, and clearly happy to see his daughter thriving. The years rolled by, marked by the changing seasons and the steady growth of both their family and their ranch. Thomas grew into a serious, responsible boy who loved working with his father and learning everything he could about ranching. The twins were firebrands, as wild and free as their mother had been at their age, keeping everyone on their toes with their adventures and endless energy. When Frank was 38 and Olivia was 26, they welcomed another son into the world. John Michael Patterson was a quiet, thoughtful baby who grew into a quiet, thoughtful child, the calm in the storm of his more boisterous siblings. Frank often found him sitting on the porch with a book, or watching the desert with contemplative eyes, and he wondered what the future held for his youngest. By 1890, Patterson Ranch had grown into one of the most successful operations in Arizona. They ran 5,000 head of cattle across 2,000 acres, employed 15 full-time hands, and had established contracts with buyers as far away as Chicago. Frank had more than justified Thomas's faith in him, building not just a successful business but a legacy that would continue long after he was gone. But success had never been Frank's real goal. What mattered to him was the life he had built with Olivia, the family they had created together, the partnership that had only grown stronger with each passing year. She was still his best friend and his most trusted advisor, the person he turned to first with good news or bad, the one whose opinion he valued above all others. "You ever regret it?" he asked her one night as they sat on their porch, watching their children play in the yard while the sun set behind them. "Choosing this life. You could have gone anywhere, done anything. Instead, you are stuck on a ranch in the middle of the desert with a cowboy who still does not quite understand how he got so lucky." Olivia laughed and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Frank Patterson, I fell in love with you when I was 15 years old. I watched you from a distance for years, waiting and hoping that one day you would see me as more than just your foreman's daughter. When you finally did, when you finally let yourself love me back, it was like every dream I had ever had coming true at once. This life, this ranch, these children, it is not settling or making do. It is everything I ever wanted and more than I dared to hope for. I have never regretted choosing you, not for a single moment." Frank pulled her close, kissing her with all the love that still filled his heart after 10 years of marriage. "I love you," he said against her lips. "Today, tomorrow, and every day after. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Olivia, the absolute best thing." Their children grew and thrived, each finding their own path in the world. Thomas took over more and more of the ranch operations as he entered his 20s, proving himself to be a natural leader with his grandfather's strategic mind and his father's work ethic. The twins both married local boys and settled within riding distance, starting families of their own and filling Frank and Olivia's house with grandchildren who brought new joy and chaos into their lives. John, true to his contemplative nature, went east to study law and eventually returned to Arizona to practice, handling the ranch's legal affairs and building a reputation as one of the finest attorneys in the territory. Thomas Ramsey passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 68, surrounded by his family and content with the life he had lived. Frank grieved the loss of the man who had been father, mentor, and friend, but he took comfort in knowing that Thomas had lived to see his daughter happy and his legacy secure. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple stone that bore his name and the words "a good man and a true friend." As Frank entered his 50s, he began to think about slowing down, about transitioning more of the ranch's daily operations to Thomas and the other hands. Olivia was still as vital and engaged as ever, but Frank could feel the years beginning to catch up with him, his joints protesting the long days in the saddle and his body requiring more rest than it once had. "We should travel," Olivia announced one evening, looking up from the book she was reading. "Take a real trip, just the two of us. We could go to San Francisco or up to Oregon or even back east to New York. We have spent our whole lives in Arizona. I think we have earned a chance to see something different." Frank considered the idea, then found himself smiling. "Where do you want to go, Mrs. Patterson?" "Everywhere," Olivia said, her eyes lighting up with excitement. "I want to see the ocean and the mountains and the big cities. I want to ride a train through the Rockies and eat oysters in San Francisco and watch a play on Broadway. I want adventures, Frank. One last set of adventures before we are too old to enjoy them." They took that first trip in the summer of 1895. Leaving the ranch in Thomas's capable hands and boarding a train west to California. Frank had never seen the ocean before, and he stood on the beach in San Francisco with Olivia beside him, watching the waves crash against the shore and feeling small and awed in the face of such vastness. They visited Seattle and Portland, traveled east to Denver and Chicago, and even made it to New York City. where the crowds and noise and sheer overwhelming presence of so many people made Frank long for the quiet of the desert. But Olivia loved it all, drinking in new experiences with the same enthusiasm she had brought to everything else in her life. And Frank loved watching her discover the world beyond Arizona. When they returned home after 3 months of travel, Frank kissed the ground and swore he would never leave again. Olivia laughed and called him ridiculous, but he could tell she was happy to be home too. They had seen the world, but the desert was in their blood, and this land would always be where they truly belonged. The new century arrived with celebrations and speculation about what the future would bring. Frank was 51 years old, and Olivia was 39, and they had 4 children, 7 grandchildren, and a ranch that had exceeded every expectation. Frank should have felt satisfied, complete, but instead he found himself feeling grateful, humbled by the abundance of good things that had filled his life. "I never thought I would have any of this," he confessed to Olivia one night as they lay in bed, her head resting on his chest and his arms around her. "When I was a kid running from my stepfather, when I was a young man with nothing but a horse and a willingness to work, I never imagined I could have a home and a family and someone who loved me the way you do." "You deserve all of it," Olivia said fiercely, propping herself up to look at him. "You are a good man, Frank Patterson. You work hard and you treat people fairly and you love with your whole heart. You deserved happiness, even if you did not believe it yourself." "I believe it now," Frank said, pulling her down for a kiss. "How could I not, when I wake up next to you every morning?" They made love then, their bodies still fitting together perfectly after 20 years of marriage, and afterward, Frank held Olivia close and listened to her breathing slow as she drifted into sleep. He stayed awake for a long time, thinking about the path his life had taken, about the choices and chances and sheer dumb luck that had led him to this moment. He thought about that 8-year-old girl falling from her horse, about the teenager who had made him wildflower crowns, about the young woman who had returned from Tucson and stolen his heart without trying. He thought about all the years he had watched her grow, all the time he had spent fighting what he felt, and all the joy that had come from finally letting himself love her. Olivia stirred in his arms, murmuring something in her sleep, and Frank kissed her forehead gently. "I love you," he whispered into the darkness. "Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for seeing something in a broken-down cowboy that he could not see in himself." The years continued their steady march, bringing new grandchildren and new challenges, joys and sorrows in equal measure. Frank and Olivia grew older together, their hair turning gray and their faces gaining lines, but their love never diminished. If anything, it deepened with time, becoming something rich and complex and absolutely essential. On Frank's 60th birthday, Olivia organized a celebration that brought together their entire extended family, dozens of people filling their house and spilling out into the yard. Frank stood on the porch and looked out at the crowd, at his children and grandchildren, at the friends and neighbors who had come to mark the occasion, and felt his heart swell with gratitude. Thomas raised a glass and called for attention, then proceeded to give a speech about his father that left Frank alternating between laughter and tears. "My father is the finest man I have ever known," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "He built this ranch through hard work and integrity, but more importantly, he built a family through love and dedication. He taught me what it means to be a man, not through lectures but through example. And every day, I strive to be half the husband to my wife that he has been to my mother, half the father to my children that he has been to me." Frank pulled Olivia close as their son spoke, and she wrapped her arms around his waist, her presence steady and sure beside him. When Thomas finished and the crowd erupted in applause, Frank had to wipe tears from his eyes. "That boy of ours has a way with words," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "He learned from the best," Olivia replied, kissing his cheek. "Everything good in our children comes from you, Frank." "Everything good in our children comes from both of us," Frank corrected. "I could not have done any of this without you, Liv. You are my partner in everything, the best thing that ever happened to me." They danced that night under the stars, just as they had at their wedding 31 years earlier, and Frank held his wife close and thought about all the years that stretched behind them and all the years still to come. He was 60 years old and she was 48, and he hoped they would have decades more together. Decades of morning coffee on the porch and evening walks through the desert, of grandchildren's laughter and quiet moments stolen in the midst of busy days. The ranch continued to thrive under Thomas's management, and Frank transitioned fully into retirement, content to offer advice when asked but trusting his son to make his own decisions. He and Olivia spent their days doing the things they loved, riding out to check on the cattle not because they had to, but because they wanted to, helping with the grandchildren, reading in the evenings, and simply enjoying each other's company. "We did good, did we not?" Olivia said one afternoon as they sat on their porch and watched the sun set over the desert they both loved. "We built something that will last, Frank, something that will outlive us and carry on long after we are gone." "We did very good," Frank agreed, taking her hand and bringing it to his lips. "But what I am most proud of is not the ranch or the business or any of that. What I am most proud of is this, right here. You and me, still in love after all these years. That is the real accomplishment, Liv. That is what matters most." Olivia leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, as the sky turned orange and pink and purple. The desert landscape painted in colors that never quite lost their power to take Frank's breath away. He thought about the boy he had been, the young man who had run from Texas with nothing but a horse and a willingness to work hard. He thought about Thomas Ramsey taking a chance on him, about watching a little girl grow into the woman he would love for the rest of his life. He thought about patience and timing, about choosing and being chosen, about the courage it took to let yourself want something good. He had waited for Olivia to grow up, waited for her to be old enough to know her own mind, waited until she chose him freely and without reservation. And in return, she had given him a life richer than he had ever imagined possible. "I love you," Frank said, the words as familiar and necessary as breathing. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond, Olivia Patterson." "And I love you," Olivia replied, lifting her face for his kiss. "My cowboy, my partner, my heart. I chose you then and I choose you now and I will choose you every day for the rest of my life." They kissed as the sun disappeared below the horizon. Two people who had found each other against the odds and built something beautiful in the harsh beauty of the Arizona desert. Around them, their ranch hummed with life, their family thrived, and their legacy was secure. But in that moment, all that mattered was the feel of Olivia in Frank's arms and the knowledge that they had found what so few people ever do: true, lasting, forever love. The stars began to emerge overhead, scattered across the darkening sky like diamonds, and Frank Patterson held his wife close and gave thanks for every moment that had led him to this place, to this woman, to this life. He had been a cowboy with nothing to his name but a willingness to work hard and a heart that had learned to hope. And in the end, that had been enough. Love had been enough. Olivia had been enough. They had been enough for each other, and they would continue to be enough, through all the days and years that lay ahead. In the distance, a coyote called out to the rising moon, and Frank smiled, recognizing the sound as part of the symphony of the desert night. This was his home, his place in the world, and these were his people. He had watched the foreman's daughter grow into a woman, had waited until she chose him, and in that choosing had found everything he had ever needed. The end of one day and the promise of another stretched before them, full of possibility and peace. And Frank Patterson knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be, with exactly who he was meant to be with, living exactly the life he was meant to live. And in the end, what more could any man ask for than that?